Holy shit, boys, it's finally time. We finally get to talk about Metaphor Refantazio. Now, if you saw my video at the beginning of this year about my most anticipated games coming into 2024, you would know that Metaphor Refantazio was #1 on that list. Now, I'm a massive Persona fan. I don't know if that's obvious. I got the shirt, the other shirt, and hold on, one second. I got this. I also happen to have one of those in my car. Now, I say all this not to flex on you or show you how much of a loser I am, but I say this to sort of emphasize how big of a fan I am of these types of games. Now, if you're totally out of the loop on this game, you might be like, what does Metaphor Refantazio have to do with Persona? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, Metaphor Refantazio is directed by Katsura Hoshino and many of his team members that have been with him through making Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona 5 have come along with him to this game. See, Metaphor Refantazio is supposed to be Katsura Hoshino's answer to Final Fantasy. It's a high fantasy JRPG with the stylings of Persona, using all the lessons that Katsura Hoshino and the Persona team learned making those games, but now applying it to a new world with new characters and new gameplay mechanics. Just a heads up, this video is not going to be a review. I've only played the first 4 hours or so of the game. I played the demo that came out. You can all play it right now too. It's free. In fact, I highly recommend it. So I'm not going to be getting into spoilers or anything because obviously I don't know, but I am going to be discussing some of the basic plot elements that the demo touches on. So if you want to go in completely blind and you're a massive fan of Persona and JRPGs in general, then maybe just duck out now. However, for the rest of you that are interested in seeing my thoughts on this game, I'm glad you're here. So let's dive into it. The game starts off and it has this awesome opening anime-style cutscene where the king of this massive kingdom gets executed. Now, this shouldn't be a huge deal because the king has a son, the prince, who should be able to take over the throne, right? However, the prince is presumed to be dead by most of the kingdom, and you only find out shortly thereafter that the prince is actually alive. He's just had a curse placed under him and he's in a deep slumber. Then you get introduced to the player character, a friend of this slumbering prince, who is tasked with going to the kingdom and killing the person who killed the king in order to claim the throne for the prince. This all happens in the first 15 minutes. The game throws a lot at you right out the door, and that's pretty much all I'm going to touch on narratively, just because I don't want to get too deep into it, because honestly, I don't fully get it yet. And I think that's kind of the point. Persona 5 works in a very similar way, and so does Persona 4, where the beginnings are very slow and methodical and full of exposition. And that's what I like about those games, but it also makes it really hard to discuss this game, having only played that portion of this game. Katsura Hoshino and his team are sort of famous for very slowly integrating the player into the world that they're going to be exploring, and Metaphor is no different. In fact, I would say Metaphor does this more than Persona 5 did for sure, and probably about similarly to what Persona 4 did. So if you're unaware of the Persona games, both Persona 5 and 4 open very slowly and introduce the player to mechanics over the course of probably the first 10 hours. And my guess is Metaphor is probably going to do the same. I've only played the first 4 hours or so. In fact, I haven't even finished the demo. I'll get into why later. But you see, these games are very slow and methodical, and they deliver their exposition in very hands-off ways. They basically just say a bunch of words, and they'll just use sentences naturally, at least naturally in their world, and they integrate the player that way. And it's very hard to follow, especially now, because Persona, right, has the benefit of being set in a world very similar to ours. It's pretty much the same world as ours. It's just got this other shadow world going on, whereas Metaphor is set in a very unique, separate kingdom, and we have to sort of integrate ourselves into this, and there's a lot of terms that just get thrown at you in these first few hours, and it's really hard to follow, to be honest. Part of the fun of fantasy is not really understanding what's going on and sort of just trying to get with it. Final Fantasy XVI did this a lot as well, and it was one of my favorite things about that game, about how it's very hands-off in letting you explore the world and understand it at your own pace. And I think this game does something very similar to that game, where it has something very much like the active time lore thing that was going on in Final Fantasy XVI, and I think that's super helpful, not only for keeping up with the story, but also for picking up on words and themes that you might have missed. Speaking of themes, I know that we've only played like a couple hours of the game, but it's very clear already that this game is planning on touching on some pretty heavy themes. Already, I've seen themes of racism, classism, and other things in that vein that are sort of very touchy subjects, right? But I think they're handled with pretty diligent care here, and I really love that. And I think now in the year 2024, I don't know what the political climate or world climate is like in the East, but I know here in the West, this is the kind of thing we need to be hearing right now. We need to hear about how we are more united than we are divided. And I think that's a really fun thing to touch on here. Now, if you've played the Persona games, you know that the narratives are good, but that's not the reason you play those games, really. The reason you play Persona is the characters. And so naturally, one might ask themselves, well, are the characters in Metaphor Refantazio worth hanging out with for what is probably going to be a 100+ hour journey? And I can't answer that. Obviously, we've only played 4 hours of the game, so it's really hard to say whether or not these characters are gonna hold up the same way that characters like An or Ryuji or Teddy or Yukiko hold up, right? However, what I can say is the characters I've met and my party so far, I'm really interested in seeing what their deal is. From what I can tell about this best friend character, his backstory seems really fascinating, and he seems to have very valid reasons for going on this journey with us, and I'm excited to hear more about him and go on some hangout sessions with him. Now, one thing that threw me off during this demo, because I've avoided all of the marketing for this game, is the fact that the protagonist is voiced. And to be honest with you guys, I think this is my only real negative point of the demo. I don't know if I like that. Again, only 4 hours played, so I don't know how I'm gonna feel in a, 50 hours in or 100 hours in, but right now it feels weird. Maybe it's just my Persona brain taking over and I'm so used to these characters being silent that I'm not ready for them to be voiced yet and I just need to get more time with him. But at least right now it feels very odd. The voice acting just doesn't really work with some of the dialogue options, if that makes sense. So let me explain. Whenever you're having a conversation with somebody, these games sort of give you 3 options. One is disinterested, one is nice, and one is mean. That's the general theme. Now there's exceptions, so on and so forth, but it's generally those 3 types of options. And with this voice actor's take on the character, none of those options really work except for the being nice one. That's fine. I'm okay with that because in Persona, it always kind of felt like that was the correct option to choose anyway, but it leads me to wonder, at this point, why are we even giving these options anymore? Is it just a way to make the player feel like they're involved in the story when they're really not? I don't understand it really, and I wish that there either weren't options or the voice acting matched the options that were there. Now, again, I don't know how this is gonna shape up. I don't know if these options change as you get deeper. I don't know if the character changes as you get deeper, but right now it feels odd and I'm not the biggest fan. However, something I am a big fan of is all of the creativity in this game outside of the core narrative and characters. Now, I like that stuff, I'm into it, but my favorite part of Persona 5 is the music, the UI, the colors, and just the general visual sensory overload that that game can offer. If I had to pick one thing that really elevates Persona 5 from a great game to an all-time classic, it is those vibes, the UI, the colors, the music, all of the things that sort of coalesce into this just perfect experience of visual and auditorial mastery. And I have to say that Metaphor might even be better than Persona 5 in this regard. And that is not something I say lightly. Don't get me wrong, I know that it's still very early and I don't know how this stuff's gonna look later in the game, but right now, it's unbelievable. The way these menus look, like if you thought Persona 3 Reload had cool menus, holy fuck, bro, the menus in this game are nuts. They're next level. Like, it's just like every time you go down a menu, the face is just like getting bigger or smaller, and you got all these boxes around boxes, and it's all colorful. I mean, you'll see in the gameplay that's showing a little bit of it, and just the basic UI with the calendar number and the map and the menu, it all just looks so good. And then on top of that, the music is just unbelievable. I mean, talk about incredible music. I know it's a little trite to say at this point, Atlus's music is always next level, but I feel like we're so desensitized to it at this point, at least us in the Atlus community, right? The people who love these Persona games and love the Shin Megami Tensei games and stuff. We sort of take it for granted at this point, but I feel like when a big release like this comes out and it's going to bring new people into this fold, it's super important to call out how special it is. Like, the tracks in this game are already some of my favorites Atlus has ever made, and that's just nuts, because like, think about how many classic tracks they have. Both from Persona 5, Shin Megami Tensei 5, Persona 4, like, you can listen to those songs and just bump in your car. And I genuinely don't know if I've heard a fantasy theme as poignant as this since the One-Winged Angel remake and Final Fantasy VII remake. It's clear that Katsura Hoshino and his team really take pride in the presentation of their games, and this is some of their best work yet. I hesitate to say it's their best yet, but it's definitely right up there with Persona 5 as just some of the best presentation I've ever seen in a game. And so, with all of this glowing praise I've already given it, really the only thing left to talk about is the gameplay. Is it as fun to play as it is to watch and listen to? Well, in a word, yes, it is. It really is just as fun to play as it is to look at. So the gameplay seems very dungeon-based, much more so than Persona 5 or Persona 4 even. So Persona 4 and 5 both had these giant dungeons, and then, Persona 5 had Mementos, which was more like what's going on here, but still not quite. But Persona 4's dungeons were procedurally generated, and Persona 5 had palaces. This game seems to have more of a Pokemon Final Fantasy type of gameplay loop, where it's less these giant dungeons and more these small dungeons that you go on and go into on your road to the next quest objective. And honestly, for a fantasy game like this, I think that makes much more sense. I am gonna miss the big set pieces, especially of the Persona 5 palaces, which were all handcrafted. However, I do think that for a game like this, it makes more sense to have a lot of smaller dungeons that then have a plot beat after, and then you go through a smaller dungeon, it has a plot beat after, and so on. And I'm looking forward to the kind of groove/rhythm that you get into with these, because already in what I played, I could feel it. Now, granted, I've only played 3 of the 4 dungeons available in the demo, and I said I would mention that later, and so now I'm going to discuss that. The reason is because the narrative is very clearly heading to some kind of cliffhanger at the end of this demo, and honestly, my body just can't take that. Like, my mind and body just cannot take a cliffhanger that I have to wait 2 weeks for. So I stopped at a very good middle ground of the demo so that I could talk about it with you guys, but still not be just broken until the game comes out. But of the 3 dungeons I did play, they were all pretty varied. There were some fun boss fights, and each of them had some sort of plot breadcrumb trail you were following that was interesting enough to make the gameplay fun. And on top of that, the dungeon crawling in these games works pretty differently than almost any JRPG I've played before. So a lot of lower level enemies you can take out without even having to get into a turn-based battle, which I really love. It saves a lot of time, and it removes some of the filler padding feel that a lot of these types of games tend to have. Because if an enemy's lower than you and you're gonna beat it in one turn in a turn-based battle anyway, why are you making me go through the whole rigmarole where you play the battle music and then I do a crazy move and then they just die and then it's over? Like, why are you making me do that? So I appreciate that they're saving the player a bit of time by just letting you attack them and then they go down and then you can move on to more difficult enemies. It's sort of almost a real-time combat meets turn-based combat type thing, but the real-time combat is super rudimentary, and I would not call this a real-time game. If you don't like turn-based games at all, I honestly would not recommend this game to you. As much as I wish you would give it a chance anyway, because it's really incredible, if you really can't get behind turn-based games, then you really just shouldn't play this game, because it is functionally a turn-based RPG. And that was one of the bigger questions going into the game, the demo, is this really a turn-based RPG? Because they highlighted the real-time combat a lot in the previews, and I just was kind of put off by that. So it actually was very reassuring to me that it's very much a turn-based RPG. But if that's off-putting to you, it's off-putting to you. I went into this year with Metaphor Refantazio being my most anticipated game coming out. And after playing this demo, that still stands for sure. I cannot wait to get my hands on the full game. And yeah, I think that about does it. A little bit of a short video, but I just wanted to make sure I touched on this. And yeah, so thank you for watching. I love you guys, and I will see you in the next one.